cooler. Now you may wonder, what's in that cooler, Dave? I'm going to tell you what's in that cooler, because there's one thing in that cooler. That cooler is filled with temptation. It's a cooler full of temptation, right there. Now I know, as soon as I mentioned that that was a cooler full of temptation, your mind started racing. Does he have puppies in there? Now, there may be somebody, and you wouldn't want to admit it, but somebody who's thinking, how did you get the pool boy in there? There's so many of you are thinking, he couldn't fit his Ferrari in there, but maybe it's just the keys to the Ferrari that are in there. And there's those of you that are making a calculation, and you're saying, I've seen stacks of $100 bills. And if you started stacking them up in there, what are you going to have, 50, 60K in there maybe? Or maybe there's a check in there. Maybe there's a check with like 8 zeros. Check for $1 billion. Maybe that's what's in there. Maybe that's a cooler full of temptation, money, drugs. Or some of you are paying close attention. You're thinking, oh no, I know what's in there. Another bottle of scotch. You see, temptation is different for all of us. Temptation is not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. Temptation is a bespoke, handmade, custom-tailored thing that attaches itself to each one of us individually. None of us are tempted by exactly the same thing in exactly the same way. In fact, we in our journey of life are tempted by different things at different times, depending on the season of life, the age that we're in, the needs that we have. There are some things that were very tempting to us when we were teenagers that as we become seniors, they're not so tempting anymore. And now there are things that are very tempting to us that we never gave a second thought to before. Temptation varies from person to person, from season to season, from time to time. But there is one thing that every temptation shares with every other temptation. And that is that we all experience it. We all experience temptation. None of us can avoid it. Doesn't matter how righteous, it doesn't matter how holy, doesn't matter how saintly you are. Temptation is a part of the human experience, and we all experience it. Today I want to suggest sort of an abstract illustration of temptation. This is an 1880 Morgan silver dollar. And I want to suggest that temptation is like the face of this coin. You see, temptation is just one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is what happens to us when we give in to temptation. It is the side of guilt and regret and shame. There are two sides to the coin, one side being the temptation that we seek to resist, and the other is the shame and the guilt and the unforgiveness that covers us over after we give in to temptation. But in between, the thing that lies in between temptation and guilt is the Tao. The Tao that holds the universe together. The Tao that is the way for us to live is the thing that lies between temptation and guilt. I was clued into this idea when I read through the prayer that Jesus taught his disciples and taught us to pray. Do you remember that part where he says, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors? And then what's the next thing that he says? Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. In between those two stanzas is the Tao. The Tao is in between. The Tao is the character of our lives. The Tao is our life in between temptation and guilt. What I want us to talk about is the Tao of Jesus that dwells in between temptation and shame. But before we do that, I'd like for us to pray together, the Lord's Prayer, if you know it. Would you say it with me? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. By every measure that I know how to research out, I would imagine that everyone, regardless of their spiritual orientation, regardless of their spiritual disposition or even their displeasure, their lack of spirituality, I would guess that everyone who knows anything about Jesus of Nazareth and the story of Jesus would say, yeah, he was a good guy. That we could all agree that he was an exemplary life, that his life, the historical person of Jesus, really changed the course of Western civilization, changed the course of human history. So he lived a life that we would call good. We might even say that he lived the example of a pure life. I don't think it's too much of a stretch for us to agree that Jesus of Nazareth lived an exemplary and pure life. The problem is, what does that mean? What does a pure life look like? And I'm afraid we get confused. We make the mistake of equating purity with piety. And purity and piety are not the same. Piety is like the face on the coin. Purity is like the substance that the coin is made of. Purity is character. Piety is outward behavior. You can be pious and be impure. And you don't have to be pious to be pure. And Jesus was the purest of all human beings, and his life was far from pious. In fact, his life was messy. He was constantly challenging the status quo. He was turning over the apple carts, literally turning over the tables in the temple. He was confrontational with those who misrepresented the character of God. He was confusing to those who were close to him. He was a person who lived a messy life, and I want to suggest that the life he lived was the Tao of purity. But a better way to understand it, I think, is that he lived a life of grace. See, I believe that what is in between the temptations that we face and the shame and the guilt that we carry is grace. Because when we are tempted and we are seeking to be the best version of ourselves, and we're seeking to resist the temptation that would tear us down, we need to rely on God's grace to persevere. In the same way, when we fall and we fail, as we all do, when we seek forgiveness, when we seek restoration, when we seek to unburden ourselves from the shame and guilt of our own mistakes, it's grace that we need in abundance. And grace is what purity is. A pure life is a life of grace. It is the life of the Tao. Jesus' example, his life showed us this Tao of grace, this Tao of purity. But I want to look at one story. A snapshot from his life that shows more clearly that Tao of grace, that Tao of purity, than perhaps any other story from his life. It is the story of his temptation. It's recorded for us in the 4th chapter of Matthew and the 4th chapter of Luke. It tells us about the beginning, the first days of Jesus' public ministry. It says in Matthew chapter 4 that the Holy Spirit led him out into the wilderness to be tested, to be tempted by the personification of evil, the devil himself, Satan. He was led into the wilderness. You know what the wilderness is. And I'm not talking the national wilderness with trees and forests and wild animals. I'm talking the wilderness of loneliness. I'm talking the wilderness of failure. I'm talking the wilderness of shame and guilt and disappointment and regret. I'm talking the wilderness that all of us find ourselves in from time to time, and many times we don't know how we got there. We find ourselves in the middle of the wilderness, lost and alone, and we're not sure that we had anything to do with bringing us there. And many times it's not our fault. It is the circumstances around us that grow dark and cold and hard. Other times we're just trying to do our best, and we wind up in a dark and a foreboding wilderness. It's like if you drive to work every day on the same route, and one day you're preoccupied with thoughts, and you find yourself 3 exits down from where you normally turn off, and you're like, how did I don't even remember driving by where I was supposed to make that turn, where I make that turn every day. We find ourselves many times in a wilderness of circumstances that are not our fault. But occasionally, we press into the wilderness on our own. We press into the Tao. We press into the purification of our souls. And this is what Jesus was doing. That's why when he went out into the wilderness, he went there with a discipline and didn't eat or drink for 40 days and 40 nights. He fasted for 40 days. You ever fasted? You ever fasted for 40 days? I've fasted for 40 days. One time, my wife and I, stupidest thing we ever did. I mean, we were desperate is what it was. We had been living in California doing good ministry there, and we had a sense that our time was over, and we needed God to show us where to go next. And so in order to kind of purify our focus and our priorities, we said we're going to pray every day, and we're going to fast together for 40 days. What a dumb idea. I mean, you know, and I kind of cheated. We drank protein shakes, and I drank, you know, tomato soup and chicken broth. I mean, so it wasn't like we didn't have anything for 40 days. And people would tell me, oh, yeah, I fasted for a week one time, or I fasted one time for a few days. And after, 24, 48 hours, you don't feel it anymore. I'm like, liar. You're a liar. I was hungry every single day. Every day I was hungry. I still fast. Fasting now. Every Saturday before I teach, I've done this for 40 years. Every time before I teach, the day before, I don't eat. I say, well, that's pretty stupid. Well, yeah, it's not the smartest thing I do, but here's what it does for me. It clears the table. It says all that time that you would spend thinking about or reaching for snacks or thinking about what you're going to have for lunch or for dinner, I think about this moment. I think about this time. I kind of rearrange my priorities, and I try to enter into that Tao, into that place of purity. That's where Jesus was. He was in the wilderness. And he had inserted himself there. The Spirit had led him to this place of vulnerability. If you ever wonder why life is not fair, it's because when we need to be our strongest is when we are at our most vulnerable. And that's not fair. But this is where purity is fashioned. It is in the crucible of the wilderness that our character is refined. And Jesus was proving something there in the wilderness, that his heart and his soul and his character were pure. And they were put to the test. What happens in Matthew and Luke in the story of the temptations is we're told 3 temptations took place. Over the last 2,000 years, theologians have done exegetical backflips trying to figure out, okay, what's the significance of the 3 temptations? Is it like Father, Son, Holy Spirit? Is the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life? Dissertations have been written, books have been written, arguments have been undertaken. Churches have split over the meaning of the significance of the temptations and the details and exegetical points of view. And I'm like, all I know is the temptation was real, and they were all versions of the same temptation. 3 versions of the same temptation. Because I believe that all temptation starts the same way. Every temptation that we face starts with 3 words. I deserve better. There in the wilderness, it says the personification of evil, the devil, came to Jesus. And he first of all says to him, hey, if you're the Son of God, turn these stones into bread. And he was in the Judean wilderness. This was a place, he was surrounded by stones. He was literally in Mrs. Baird's bakery of stones. He could have made enough loaves to feed the nation of Israel. And this isn't fair. I mean, because he was the person who could do it. He was going to turn the water into wine. He was going to feed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. He's the only human being who ever lived who had the ability to turn stones into bread. He could do it. But it was a temptation to satisfy his indulgences, to satisfy his appetites beyond what he needed. It is that temptation that we face, that temptation for more than enough. When our life is sufficient and we hold God hostage because he hasn't given us enough, it is the temptation of the stones into bread. The second temptation is when he takes him to what's called the pinnacle of the temple, or the high point of the temple. Most historians believe that it was along the eastern wall of Herod's temple, overlooking the Kidron Valley, as there was a point there on the eastern wall that was 430 feet above the floor of the Kidron Valley. And we don't know whether he took him there physically or showed him a vision of this, but he experienced what it was like to be at that dizzying height. And the devil said to him, throw yourself down. If you're the Son of God, throw yourself down. And then he quotes chapter and verse. He quotes Psalm 91, verses 11 and 12. It's a psalm of the celebration of God's provision. It's a celebration of God's sufficiency. And he quotes Psalm 91, and he says, because you have a promise. You have a promise that God will not let your foot strike against a stone. God will take care of you. It's a temptation we often face. Temptation we often face because we get in our mind that the expectation we have of God is that we will never fall, or we will never fail, and bad things will never happen to us or to the people that we love. And when bad things do happen to us, and we do strike our foot against a stone, and we do fall from the heights of fame and fortune, and we fall on difficult days, we write God off. We're like, oh, well, you lied to us. It's a temptation to over-exaggerate the expectations of God's provision, that God promises that nothing bad will ever happen to us, and when it does, we're done with it. The third temptation was where he took him to a high mountain, it says. And he gave him a vision of the kingdoms of the world, the original CGI experience. Now, theologians debate whether or not these were Satan's to offer, or whether or not they were already under Jesus' authority. The validity of this temptation is often called into question. Some people wonder whether or not Jesus actually could have ever sinned. So were any of the temptations valid? Or if he could sin, did that compromise the purity of his character? I don't know. All I know is that he was tempted with this. If you will bow down and worship me, I will give you what God can't. I will do for you what your God will not do. So walk away from him and follow me. It's a temptation that we all face. It's the temptation that begins with 3 words. I deserve better. Jesus responds to all of these temptations in exactly the same way. He goes to the Hebrew Bible, and he goes to the last of the law, the last book of Moses, the last book of the Torah, the book of Deuteronomy. And when he is tempted to turn the stones into bread, he goes to Deuteronomy chapter 8, the story of the exile, the story of the exodus of the people of Israel. And he says, man does not live by bread alone. He lives by every word that comes out of the mouth of God. And he's quoting chapter and verse, where God was saying to the people of Israel who were dissatisfied with their circumstance, he was saying, yeah, I gave you a miracle. I gave you something no one had ever seen. And now you're saying that's not good enough. You don't live on the bread of God. You live on the character, the promise of God. When he took him to the pinnacle of the temple and he quoted the 91st Psalm, Jesus reaches back into the book of Deuteronomy again. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 16. And he quotes another complaint of the Israelites as they were complaining about their circumstances at Massah. And God said, why do I have to prove myself over and over and over again to you? I shouldn't have to do that. I should be enough for you. His final response is to the kingdoms of the world being laid out before him and the invitation to worship at another God's feet. And he quotes again from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 13 to 15, where God says, look, I am the only one worthy of worship. I am the only one who you can swear an oath by. I am the only one who can do what I can do. Don't be deceived, because I'm a jealous God. And what Jesus is saying in all of these responses is he is saying, God's grace is sufficient for me. He is saying, my relationship and what God has given me is enough. I do not need more. This is the world that we live in. This is the temptation that we all face. Because we say, I deserve better, and we look around at our lives and we say, this is it? This is all we get? You see, the people of Israel had been brought out of Egypt, and they had crossed through the Red Sea, and God had provided for them for 40 years. And he had guided them through the desert. And every so often they would forget what God had done and see what God hadn't done. And they would say, we want more, we want better. We're sick of manna. I can't eat any more manna. I can't eat any more manna bread. I can't drink any more manna beer. I can't eat any more manna cotti. Manna bread. Done with this. This is all I get? Really? Seriously, God? And rather than looking at the deliverance he had provided and the miracles that he laid out before them every day, they saw the things that they wished for, or the things that they thought they deserved. And they said, why don't you do this? And we live in the same place. Because we look at our life and we say, this is it? This is all I get? This is the person I'm going to be married to for the rest of my life? Really? This is it? You're the one? This is my career? This is this. I work and I invest and I make sacrifices and I try to do the right thing and I get down the road and this is as far as I've gotten. This is all I get? Really? These are my children? This is how they turned out? Seriously? I'm stuck with them for the rest of my life? Really? Rather than looking back and seeing the deliverance and the miraculous provision of God at every turn, we shake our fist and say, it's not enough. You are not enough. You are insufficient. You are inadequate to meet my needs. Temptation always begins in the same place. 3 words. I deserve better. And it always ends up in the same place. With God, you are not good enough. You are not enough for me. The temptation that Jesus faced in the wilderness, he faced the temptation to say these things. But he maintained the Tao. He stayed in that place of grace, and he would not abandon it one way or the other. And he lived an exemplary life. The example of purity, not the example of piety. He lived a life of grace. A life that was messy around the edges. A life that was organic and real and authentic and pure. It is the Tao that we seek. Temptation is different for all of us. Different ages, different stages in our life, we experience different kinds of temptations. But it's in temptation, in the wilderness, where our character is fashioned, where our soul is refined. The first coin I showed you, the 1880 Morgan silver dollar, is made up of 90% silver and 10% copper. This is a 2018 Silver Eagle silver dollar. It is 99.9% pure silver. They may look the same on the outside, but one is 100% pure. The other is almost. What is in between the faces of the coin, what is in between temptation and guilt, is the Tao. It is the way. It is the way of purity. It is the way of grace. So what's in the bag? What's in the cooler? What does temptation look like? I know some of you are going, I know what it is. It's kittens. No. Temptation, this is what temptation looks like for Dave. Torchy's Tacos. 2 delicious, trashy trailer park Torchy's Tacos. When you haven't eaten since Friday, 60 seconds in the microwave is 60 seconds from heaven for this guy. Torchy's Tacos have been sitting in my office for 24 hours, along with a Pearl Snap beer, because it is football season and you got to wash it down with something, and, lest I forget, a picture of a Ferrari. May we be reminded of the Tao of grace and purity in between temptation and guilt. Would you say the Lord's Prayer with me? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.